Next, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Heather Kimmel, who's going to be providing an update from her organization. Dr. Kimmel is a health scientist administrator with the Division of Epidemiology, Services, and Prevention Research. She's with the National Institutes on Drug Abuse, which is part of the National Institutes of Health. Thank you very much, Dr. Kimmel, for joining us today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you. Can you all hear me and see the slide? Okay. Wonderful. So, as Jason said, my name is Heather Kimmel. I'm a program official of the Epidemiology Research Branch Center at NIDA. And I want to recognize that our office in Bethesda, Maryland are located on Piscataway and Natchitoches Traverland. And it's really my pleasure today to be here to give you an update on cannabis research at NIDA. So for more than 50 years, we've seen the landscape of cannabis legalization change to a point where nearly every state in the US has some form of law on the book. So as of February of this year, 37 states, 4 territories, and DC have what's termed medical cannabis and medical marijuana laws. Since November of 2021, 18 states, 2 territories, and DC also allow for adults or recreational use of cannabis. So there's a wide variation not only in what the law itself may be termed as noted in the box here, but also in the regulation on possession limits, home cultivation, patient registration, and residency requirements, and so on. Now, at the federal level, though, cannabis is still illegal in the United States, but you may have been seeing some news reports on how there's efforts to change that currently. So it's important for us to recognize that not only do we have rapidly changing policies, we have an apparent increase in social acceptance as the perception of harm of cannabis is decreasing. And all of this is happening in the context of cannabis potency increasing. So in this graph, you can see that the potency of THC has been increasing from year to year, and this is from cannabis that received in DEA drug busts, basically. And so we need to really think about the impact of the legalization. We've already talked about some of these effects today, and we have impacts ranging from mental and physical health, economics, and criminal justice. So to add to the complexity of the regulations itself, a broad range of more than 300 medical conditions, including pain, gastrointestinal disorders, seizure-related disorders, other disorders, and symptoms are approved for medical cannabis treatments by various states. And to their websites, just as the one listed right here, that can help you find a state or states that approve nearly any symptom or condition for medical cannabis use. Now, the tricky part is that some of these are approved in some states, but they're not necessarily approved in all states. And so this is very confusing. And as we've already talked about today, the evidence base for the effectiveness of these treatments can be pretty equivocal. So this really highlights the need for rigorous scientific research and dissemination of these results. And that's where the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, comes into the picture. So NIH is comprised of 27 institutes, and NIDA is one of those 27 institutes. I do want to just take a moment to talk a little bit about what NIDA is not. So NIDA is not a regulatory agency. So you've heard people talk about the scheduling of cannabis in the United States, but that falls under the purview of the Drug Enforcement Administration, or the DEA, which is actually part of our Department of Justice. And when you're doing clinical trial, and the investigation of new drug and new drug applications fall under the purview of the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services. And NIH is also part of that department, but we're different offices in that department. So at NIDA, we do have conversations with DEA and FDA, but it's really important for us to have the evidence base for those discussions. And that's where the researchers that we fund at NIH can have a huge impact. So here, you can see a snapshot of the cannabinoid research supported by NIH Institute at FY20, and this is the most recent data we have available. The research is supported in 3 general areas: the endocannabinoid system, therapeutic cannabinoid research, and cannabidiol research. And even during a very challenging time, NIH's cannabinoid research portfolio remained very strong. So in the fiscal year 2020, we supported 424 projects for almost $185 million. And of these, NIDA provided support for 253 projects, totaling almost $104 million. And these numbers represent about 60% of the total NIH projects and about 56% of the total NIH funding. So the takeaway message from all these numbers on the slide is that if you're interested in NIH funding research, you should start with NIDA. Now, that said, the interest and support for cannabis research at other NIH institutions is growing. So I've listed some examples here, and these include the co-use of cannabis and alcohol at NIH AAA, treatment for pain and other conditions at NCCIH, the effects on psychosis and brain development at NIMH, use by cancer patients at NCI, and use by older patients at NIA, so just to name a few. So looking more closely at NIDA, the 200 plus projects we support span across the entire institute, from epidemiology to neuroscience policies. I'll come back to the epidemiology branch in a moment, but I want to point out that the work that we do at NIDA is often done in the context of substance use and mental health disorders. Now, a prevention program includes the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development, or ABCD study. And so NIDA partners with several other NIH institutes to support the study, which is the largest long-term study of brain development and child health in the United States, with nearly 12,000 children enrolled. And so this study will allow researchers to assess how childhood experiences interact with each other and the changing physiology to affect brain development. And this also includes the impact of cannabis policies and exposure. A basic science program includes the study of the endocannabinoid system, as well as the impact of cannabis exposure on the structure and the function of the brain and the nervous system. So one of these studies, also in partnership with NIH Institute, is the Healthy Brain and Child Development, or the HBCD study, which examined how environmental exposure, especially opioid and other drug use, including cannabis, affects infant and child brain development. We also look at the prevalence of cannabis use disorder and the development of medications and devices for treatment and relapse prevention. And given the rapidly changing policy environment, we're also supporting work examining the impact of different regulatory models, marketing, taxes on cannabis use, as well as the social, cultural, educational, and economic impact. So I think we see that from these research areas that a lot of NIDA's priorities actually overlap with the ones that we've heard about today. So in my branch at NIDA, in the epidemiology research branch, we provided multiple vehicles for the scientific community to respond to in terms of looking at cannabis, starting in 2011. So on this slide here, I've shown you some of the currently active funding opportunities, and our time-sensitive mechanisms, PAR, now have the cannabis research component included. And NIDA, as well as much of NIH, is moving away from the more traditional funding opportunity announcement. And we've been issuing several notices of special interest, which are denoted by this energy here. And these allow us to be a lot more responsive to what's happening in the real world. And the 5 notices that we show here either include a cannabis component, or they're pretty much focused on cannabis itself. We also have an opportunity coming later this year in 2022 for the development of a medical cannabis registry to gather information on what health symptoms people are treating, what products they're using, the amount of frequency they're using, as well as the outcome, both positive and negative. So stay tuned for more information about that. And I do want to note that this is not an exact list of cannabis funding opportunities at NIDA. It's certainly not NIH. And so I put the website here where you can do a search for more funding. Whoops. So in talking about funding projects in the branch, in the epidemiology research branch, we funded over 60 projects related to policy, including topics ranging from prevalence of cannabis use, health disparities, policy of disease, and economics. However, there are still many directions the research needs to go, and NIDA's Advisory Council formed a subgroup to review and provide some guidance in this regard. So these are some of the directions listed here. Some that are pretty interesting are looking at the potency and the composition of cannabis products, as we've seen the potency has been increasing quite dramatically over the last few years. But we're also seeing a lot of different types of products on the market. And we're also really interested in the therapeutic effects that we've been discussing here in the conference. Now, the pandemic also highlighted some new research areas such as the role of isolation in cannabis use, as well as the long-term effects of COVID-19 in patients using cannabis. What I wanted to do was to show you just a tiny bit of data, and that's always kind of the fun part of giving this presentation. So the data here are from the NIDA funded Monitoring Future study, which is an annual study of 8th, 10th, and 12th graders conducted by researchers at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. So since 1975, the survey has measured how teens report the drug, alcohol, and cigarette use and related attitudes. They started 12th graders in 1975, and they added 8th and 10th graders to the survey in 1991 to start looking at younger children. So in the most recent data collection in 2021, 32,260 students from 319 public and private schools participate in the survey, and it's about 3/4 of the normal annual sample. So we're still feeling some effects of the pandemic on the sample side. And this slide focuses on cigarette, cannabis use, and vaping in 12th grade study in 1991. So what you can see is that cigarette use, which is lined here, but peaked around 1997 and then declined to about, and the peak was around 35% and declined to about 4% in the most recent data collection. And then in terms of cannabis use, you can see cannabis use increasing until about 1997, and then it sort of flattened off at about 20% that period of time. Now, note this orange circle. Sorry about that. Note this orange circle here in 2009. And so this is when cigarette use and cannabis use were comparable, right here. And then we see the continued decline in cigarette use after that time period, but not in cannabis use. Now, questions on vaping were added in 2017, and you can see that vaping nicotine, which is defined here, has actually increased above both cigarette use and cannabis use, and seems to be coming back down a little bit. So whether there's an effect of the pandemic or not, we're not entirely sure. And then we also had questions about vaping cannabis, and then that increased above cigarette use. So we're definitely seeing some changes in behavior in this age group based on these new derivatives and new products that are on the market. I want to mention briefly too that another resource that NIDA has is providing cannabis for research use. And cannabis is illegal under federal law, as I mentioned earlier, but NIDA has a contract with the University of Mississippi to grow cannabis for use in research studies. And so researchers with the appropriate DEA vouchers and IND of doing human studies can request and receive cannabis cigarette, bulk cannabis, and or extracts for their work. Now, in May of 2021, the DEA announced that they were expanding access to cannabis for researchers by registering additional cannabis growers. So instead of having one source for this research cannabis, we'll have multiple sources available to us. I also wanted to mention that very recently, NIDA and other partner institutes at NIH issued a notice requesting that researchers measure and report their findings in clinical research on cannabis using a standard unit dose, THC of 5 milligrams, that is comparable to what we see for opioid research and other substance use. One thing that I want to mention about this is that this is not a limit on how much can be used in experiment. And it's also not a recommendation for consumption. So I want to make sure that we were clear on what this is saying here. And this brings me to the end of this very brief overview of NIDA and NIH cannabis research. I've also listed a few resources here, including my contact information and the contact information for the branch chief of the epidemiology research branch, Marsha Noghat. And thank you so much for your time and your attention today, and please don't hesitate to send me a question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kimmel. And if there's any questions, please put them into the Q&A. And there is a question from Jeffrey Wardell. Will the expansion of cannabis production for research include higher potency for cannabis options?
That's a good question, and it really does depend on the companies that are selected for this program to provide research cannabis. I think I can't speak too much about that right now because it's kind of an ongoing process. But I think the intent is to try to map a little bit more realistically what's happening in the real world and try to have the products that are available for researchers be more like the products that are available on the street. So I can't speak specifically to answer that question, but that's the intent of the program, is to provide a wider range of products for these research programs. But thank you for that question.
And one more question from Liz Thompson. Has there been any talk by NIH about policies on capping a limit of THC % in isolates available for sale?
Well, if you're talking about products that are available out in the general market, that's not our purview. So again, NIH and NIDA are not regulatory agencies. This falls under the purview of the DEA and potentially the FDA, depending on what the intent of these products is. And so this is not something that we can regulate. Now, however, that's certainly something that we need to sort of better understand from a scientific perspective. And so we definitely want to make sure that we're providing the evidence base to support the need for those kinds of regulations.
Great, thank you. I think if you have more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll move on to the next speaker. James?
Thank you so much, Dr. Kimmel, for that presentation. It was fascinating to see the range of activities that are being sponsored by NIDA and those tectonic shifts in patterns of use over time.